Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone. I know everyone's a little short on energy. I think a few of us stayed up a little past our typical bedtimes last night. I don't, maybe it's just me. So my name is Alden Landry, and I am the Faculty Assistant Director for the Office for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Partnership. And I've had the pleasure of coordinating these equity and social justice lecture series for the past 3 or so years. Just to give you a little bit of background about our equity and social justice lecture series, these are dialogues which target our Harvard and Longwood communities, as well as Greater Boston, with the goal of bringing into the historical, current, and future state of health equity and social justice issues. And we try and focus on 4 key areas: history and context, culture and environment, health disparities, and leadership and skills development. This is an exciting topic because this is sort of cutting edge information, and we're having an opportunity to talk about a health equity issue really in the forefront of the emerging stages of new technology and something that's going to impact our patients' care and also our communities. We have assembled a great keynote and list of panelists, and I think we're going to have a really rich discussion over the next few hours, and I'm just want to say thank you all for getting up this morning and coming to join us. Unfortunately, our Dean Reed is not able to join us, but she sends her greetings. And with that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, who is going to be Vence Bonham. He's the Senior Advisor to the Director on Genomics and Health Disparities at the National Human Genome Research Institute, NIH. Vence is a graduate of Michigan State University and earned a law degree from The Ohio State University. Since 2003, Mr. Bonham has served as Associate Investigator for the National Human Genome Research Institute in the Division of Intramural Research, Social and Behavioral Research Branch. He leads Health Disparities Genomics Unit, which conducts research that evaluates and approaches to integrate new genomic knowledge and precision medicine into clinical settings without exacerbating inequities in healthcare delivery. He also serves as Senior Advisor to the NHGRI Director, and his research focuses primarily on social influences of new genomic knowledge, particularly in communities of color. With that, I want to say welcome to Mr. Vence Bonham.
So good morning. I am pleased to be here and look forward to this conversation that we're going to have this morning, and pleased to be with such a great panel and have an opportunity to talk with each of you. So what I want to do today is really just kind of set a context and talk about a few issues that I think are important in this conversation as we think about precision medicine and where we are today in 2019 and the hopes for the future. But let me just start that this is my voice. It's not the voice of the Department of Health and Human Services or NIH or the Genome Institute. It's my voice as an intramural researcher and my perspective and my lens. So I'm not saying that everything that I would say is what NIH would say or the department would say. So let me just start. When I think about precision medicine, I really think about a variety of ways to think about how do you provide much more individualized care to an individual patient that can provide benefit. And so with this slide, just thinking about diagnostics, risk assessment, pharmacogenomics, new drugs that are directly unique for an individual or population of individuals, and then genetic therapies, I think, are all fit within the scope of what I would describe as precision medicine. So this slide is a slide that I took with my iPhone that I show oftentimes when I give talks. And I think it's pretty relevant for this audience here because actually this is in the state of Massachusetts. So my family visits Martha's Vineyard almost yearly now. And this is a slide that I took in Chappaquiddick a couple years ago. And I was walking down this path and I saw this and I said, I need to take a picture of this because I think this is a good metaphor for where we are with regards to genomic medicine, precision medicine, and the future. So if you look at this path, you see the path is going down, but you see a divide in the path. And I argue that really that's where we are with precision medicine, the potential of this divide in the path where some will actually be able to benefit and others will not. And so I argue from the perspective of my research and the work that I'm doing at the Genome Institute, how can we limit that divide in the path? So I use this really to help us think about this question of where we are today in 2019 and where will we be in 2025, 2030 with regards to the actual integration of precision medicine and clinical care for all of your patients. And how do we make sure that those patients that are typically under-resourced get the benefits of precision medicine that's developing the innovation and excitement that's occurring today. And I'm one that believes we truly are in a revolutionary period of time with regards to biomedical research. And here I am at this great institution that's leading a lot of that work. But the question is actually who will benefit from the work that you're doing and the work that's being conducted at this institution and institutions across the world. So what I want to do this morning is talk about four challenges with regards to making sure that precision medicine can benefit all. So my first challenge is the lack of diversity in genomics research. And I argue this is the number one challenge, the lack of diversity in genomic and precision medicine research. And I really am framing it around genomic and kind of genetic diversity and genetic understanding with regards to understanding of difference related to health and treatment. And this is an interesting conversation, and I have this conversation all the time about this lack of diversity and the importance of the lack of diversity. And our institute had a meeting 2 weeks ago now. Eric Landry was there, a variety of people from Harvard and Broad and MIT were there. And it was a conversation about not the social justice reason why we must have diversity, the scientific imperative to have diversity. And it's an interesting conversation that's going on, I think, within the field of genomics today, with a recognition that diversity is a requirement from a scientific perspective. But I argue we must also at the same time have this conversation about the need for diversity related to access and equity and a social justice lens of thinking about precision medicine. So when we think about and talk about this issue of diversity, this is a huge issue, and there's been some really important work that's come out over the last few years. And I just want to highlight this study, and actually I'm highlighting two studies here in this article. This was published in Nature in 2016 by Alice Popejoy, who at that time was a graduate student at UW out in Seattle with Malia Fullerton, where they replicated a study that was done by Carlos Bustamante and David Goldstein in 2009. And so they replicated the study in 2016. And they showed that with regards to where we are with regards to the diversity in the databases at that time, that over that period of 2009 to 2016, during the past 7 years, there continue to be a major number of our samples are focused on European populations. But there had been some increase, and the increase was specifically with Asian populations. Individuals from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, where there had been an increase between 2009 and 2016. But with regards to those populations in the United States that are commonly identified as those populations that are underrepresented, underserved, there actually had not been an increase. That between 2009 and 2016, we really still have less than 4% of the population in the genomics research studies are from African American, Latino populations, American Indian populations. So this challenge with regards to understanding ancestral diversity across populations that are often disparity populations continues to be a major issue. But then I had an opportunity to work with Latrice here, with Dr. Landry, on a study that we conducted that was published in Health Affairs. And I know she may talk about this in the panel a little bit. But this study really looked at specific diseases and looked at studies that were looking at both genome-wide association studies and sequencing studies that focused on diseases to see, do we see similar or different findings than what Fullerton and Popejoy identified. And we clearly found the same types of gaps with regards to diverse populations, so that the majority of the studies in the public genomic databases, dbGaP and GWAS catalog, are based on populations of European ancestry. This continues to be an issue with regards to disease-specific, cancer-specific studies. And significantly fewer studies exist of African, Latin American, and Asian ancestral populations. So when you look generally with regards to the data in the databases, there's this gap. And when you look specifically at studies of diseases, there is a gap. And that this gap continues, and this gap will continue the divide, and I argue, with regards to who will benefit from precision medicine. So when we think about this broadly, and there was a study that just came out on genome-wide association studies where they really looked at a variety of different issues. You see this article from Vox, this recognition that this is a problem. We have a problem in science with the lack of diversity of populations, ancestral populations, in the research that will actually create harm for everyone, but particularly for those populations that are missing. So, lack of diversity in genomics research, the potential of precision medicine to improve health for benefit patients from all backgrounds will depend on the ability to correctly interpret genomic variants. And without having those populations in this study, it will continue to be a major issue. We have seen a number of examples with regards to the problems that can occur with regards to the ability to assess the risk for individual patients. So challenge 2, communicating human genetic variation. Communicating human genetic variation. So one of the areas of work that I've been involved in really almost the whole 15 years since I've been at the Genome Institute is how we think about difference and talk about difference with regards to genomics. And I argue that this is also going to be important for the success of precision medicine, is how do we communicate difference to both patients, the general public, to providers, and how do we use this information in a way to help in providing quality health care to individual patients. So I'm just going to show you a couple slides from a couple studies just to particularly focus on how the populations in the studies are described. Okay? So this study here, the researchers are basically using the OMB categories of race and how they describe the populations in their study. And this study, these two studies, they use ancestral population descriptors using continental geographic descriptors. So what does this mean when you talk about an individual patient? And how do we interpret that? And then this last that just came out in New England Journal of Medicine just before the end of the year that was focused on issues with regards to kidney disease and APOL1, you see they use specific geographic locations, Haiti, Antigua, Trinidad, Panama, as how they described their populations in their study. So what's going to help us in communicating to patient populations? How do we approach this? And why do I talk about this when we're talking about precision medicine? Well, I think this issue of how we think about difference and the issue of race is a conversation within the field of genomics that we must continue to have and explore How do we communicate difference? How do we talk about difference? What is the role of race? What is race? And what do we do with regards to actually providing individualized care to patients? And exploring this question. This science commentary from 2016 by Sarah Tishkoff and her colleagues argues that the field of genetics and genomics must move away from using race in research studies and exploring this question of, is there a better way to communicate variation than how researchers do today? And I argue that we must think about this question, and we must think about it in the context of precision medicine and where we are and where we're going. And so one of the interesting areas is to talk about how we use race and ethnicity in talking about treatment and drug response and differences. And we recognize that people from different ancestral backgrounds may actually metabolize drugs differently, may benefit from drugs differently, and we must recognize and use that in a way to provide the best care for the individual patient. But how do we talk about the populations? What do we do in a way that will help us in communicating to a patient population? So the question of race and medicine, I think, is part of this conversation related to precision medicine. A few years ago, I conducted a study of practicing internal medicine physicians, where we surveyed their knowledge of genetic variation, their use of race in clinical practice. And we asked a number of questions. And we asked two questions. What does race mean to you? And what does ethnicity mean to you? And these are the findings from this study. And you see that the vast majority of the physicians in our study identified race as a genetic or biological group, okay? A genetic or biological group. But you'll see that the majority of the physicians identified ethnicity as a cultural or a social group. Now this is interesting when I read a lot of literature and you see race/ethnicity when describing the populations in the study, and how we think about these concepts and use these concepts within medicine, within a social context, within our society. And so how do we communicate both the recognition that ancestral backgrounds may have genetic variation that's different, but also understanding that race and ethnicity are clearly social constructs that influence our lives? So we asked the question, biological difference between racial groups affect health outcome differences. Almost all of the physicians agreed with this statement, either somewhat agreed or strongly agreed. And then we asked whether race is the best proxy clinicians have to identify genetic effects. And you see a much different kind of slope with regards to responses. Now this study was conducted in 2012. I'm curious if I do this study today, will I have any different responses? And so maybe this is going to be something that's on my research agenda as we go forward. But this question of how healthcare providers think about these issues is extremely important. I want to bring to your attention a paper that just came out in December of last year, a content analysis of the views of genetic professionals on race, ancestry, and genetics. Michael Bamshad is the senior author along with Charmaine Royal. And it really does a nice job of an analysis that they did of a survey that they conducted with all of the genetics societies, the American Society of Human Genetics, the Medical College of Genetics, the genetic counselors, and exploring how these professionals think about race and ethnicity and ancestry and use it. And this quote from the article I just really like. I have somehow managed to hold seemingly mutually exclusive views that race don't exist and are biologically meaningless, and races have a genetic basis and biological influences on health. This tension how we think about difference and communicate difference, I argue, is part of the context of the future of precision medicine. And that to really have the benefits of precision medicine, we're going to have to tackle and struggle with these concepts as we talk about care for individual patients. So my director, Eric Green, and the director of the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, Eliseo Perez-Dable, and I published a viewpoint in JAMA last November where we argued now is the time to really grapple with population descriptors in genomics and biomedical research. That we really need to push researchers, NIH, the community, in how we use these descriptors and be more thoughtful and rigorous in the way we approach it. So what we've done is we have now pulled together about 16 to 17 different institutes and centers at NIH that are all interested in this topic, where we are coming together to talk about what next steps NIH should take and really exploring this issue of how we're using population descriptors in our work. So precision care, not race-based care, the potential of precision medicine to improve health for patients from all ancestral backgrounds will depend on the use of genomic information. All right, challenge 3, access to precision medicine. And the case study I'm going to use is pharmacogenomics. But I want to start with this framework. My colleague at Johns Hopkins is Lisa Cooper, who some of you may know. Dr. Cooper is a general internist, epidemiologist, and she developed this framework, and I asked her if I could take her framework and modify it for a genomic context. So what I did was I really thought about this from the perspective of what are the barriers, what are the issues of services and the mediators and outcomes that are important with regards to both research and then ultimately care for individuals related to genomic medicine. And I highlight here a couple things that I want to just bring to your attention. One of the areas that I see as extremely important is scientific knowledge. This is this issue about understanding diversity, understanding our ancestral diversity, understanding what that means from the perspective of differences in gene variants related to disease and health and treatment. And so without that information, we're going to fail. So a barrier is making sure that we have that scientific knowledge. But this issue of costs, insurance coverage, reimbursement is too, and also a major barrier that I would argue with regards to the ability to actually integrate genomic medicine and precision medicine into clinical care. So thinking about it from that perspective, that is one of the key areas. So what are one of the areas of mediators? So I would highlight with regards to mediators that actually could benefit or potentially be challenges are related directly to the provider. Okay? The issues of the skills, the knowledge of the provider, the biases of the provider, the stereotypes of the provider are important in the ability to have positive outcomes with regards to the integration of genomics and precision medicine into clinical care. And the ultimate goal here are the outcomes, and how do we increase health, reduce mortality, improve the benefits to all populations. So exploring these questions and using this kind of a framework to think about those issues. So I want to give one case example that's a pharmacogenomic case example. And so I want to talk about Clopidogrel for a minute. And I think Clopidogrel is a good example of something that's here today with regards to genetic testing. We're not talking about the future. We're not talking about a situation that's very expensive, but can actually have an impact on the individual's life. So clearly, this is a drug that many patients are on, maybe many patients you prescribed are put on this drug. This drug is an important part of the treatment of individual patients today. But not everyone can metabolize this drug. And so clearly there's been a lot of work and guidelines with regards to appropriate use of Clopidogrel and issues with regards to genetic testing. And so I would argue from a precision medicine today and this issue of equity, this is an example that we can all think about, not from a perspective of a very expensive type of a testing or treatment, but from a pretty reasonable, appropriate way to make a judgment with regards to whether a drug is correct for a person or not. And so I'll tell you a little story. And this is an interesting story. It's ongoing. The story has not ended at this point in time. I don't know what's going to happen with this story, but I think it's an important story for us to think about in the context of my talk today about who will benefit and the promise of precision medicine. So now about 4 years ago, as everyone knows, I was trained originally as a lawyer. The Attorney General of the state of Hawaii filed a lawsuit. And the Attorney General filed a lawsuit against the pharmaceutical companies that make Clopidogrel. And he argued in this lawsuit that between 20 and 30% of the population of his state cannot metabolize that drug well. And that the pharmaceutical company knew this information and failed to communicate that to the healthcare providers within their state. Because greater than 50% of Native Hawaiian populations, Pacific Islander populations, have an A allele that actually has an impact on the ability to metabolize the drug. And so therefore, individuals should be tested, should have the genetic test, whether this is an appropriate drug for them or not. This case is ongoing. I don't know what's going to happen with this case, but it raises an interesting question about, do we now, right now, today, have approaches to provide better care, more precise care for individual patient populations that we're not following? And are there ways that we can integrate precision medicine into clinical care today? So I argue that when we think about precision medicine, we're not always thinking about whole genome sequencing or major, very expensive testing or treatments. We're also thinking about, how do you integrate actual use of technology and knowledge that we have today in a way that can benefit individual patients. So coming back to the framework, this issue of scientific knowledge, the issues of cost, the issues of thinking about this in the context of genomic medicine, the issues of provider knowledge and biases is an important component to ultimately look at this assessment of whether precision medicine actually will improve outcomes. All right, but it's not just from the framework of thinking about the delivery system of an individual patient and provider. We must also think about these questions from an organizational behavior perspective in thinking about these issues. This, again, is also some of the work that Dr. Cooper has done. But I want to highlight here from the perspective of this conversation about precision medicine and clinical care and access to precision medicine, this issue of equitable care and the issue of diversity of workforce, organizational structure that's being taken on by institutions to actually tackle the issues of integration of precision medicine. I mentioned to Dr. Landry that I had an opportunity last summer at a National Academies of Science meeting to interact with Dr. Armstrong, Katrina Armstrong from here, about some of the exciting things that are happening here on better ways to integrate precision medicine across all your patient populations. And how do you think about those issues in a way to address barriers? So organizational behavior is an important component, whether precision medicine actually will benefit or not. And so I argue that when we study and think about these questions, we need to be thinking about the organization as well as the individual provider and patient. So access to precision care, the potential of precision medicine to improve health for patients from all ancestral backgrounds will depend on provider knowledge, decision-making, and costs. So challenge 4. Challenge 4 is really looking into the future. But I argue if we're going to have a conversation about will everyone benefit or not, that we need to think about what is on the horizon and some of the exciting things that are happening on the horizon that I believe that will be important component of precision medicine. And I argue just a component, but will be a part of precision medicine for the future. And so I want to highlight access to curative genomic therapies and how we need to think about that also today. as we think about the integration of precision medicine. So I want to talk about some research that I'm involved in that is also directly related to work that's going on right here in Boston. And that's the issue of somatic gene editing related to sickle cell disease. Somatic gene editing related to sickle cell disease. So I'm not talking about germline now. I'm focused on somatic gene editing, the care of an individual patient. And so really focused on it from that perspective and not the ethical questions about germline gene editing that are so important, but the opportunities today and that are on the horizon for somatic gene editing and gene therapy to actually benefit diseases that have an impact significantly on disparity populations. And the disease that I study is sickle cell disease. And so there is some great work that's happening here in Boston around particularly BCL11A, a gene that's involved with regards to fetal hemoglobin, to ability to modify that gene in a way to enhance the fetal hemoglobin and reduce the severity of the disease. So Stu Orkin and all his group here in Boston are really leading that work with a number of the biotech companies here in the city. But there's also work going on around the beta globin gene of actually correcting the point mutation that causes sickle cell disease. So these are two approaches that are now, one's already in clinical trials, the other one's moving to clinical trial, that are going to have the potential of actually curing the disease. I don't know if anybody saw the New York Times article last Sunday about sickle cell disease. There's a lot of work. Marnie's involved in some work in this area. So there's broader question about curative genetic therapies and the potential benefit. But I argue this is too an issue of equity that we need to think about and explore. And to explore it from a couple different perspectives. One is cost. So when we think about these curative genetic therapies and we think about the cost of these therapies, this is going to be a question about who actually will get access to it. We'll have the clinical trials, they will go forward, but as this gets integrated into clinical care, who will actually be able to get access to this? The expected cost right now is between $500,000 and $700,000. We don't know exactly what it will be by the time it comes to the clinic, but clearly this is going to be a major cost with regards to the ability to have access to these therapies. Who will get access? What are the issues around access? How will the decisions be made? What types of policy will be put in place to help to facilitate access? How do we question this from a perspective of limited resources and how we explore limited resources? So this is a question I think that we have to think about today and not just in the future. And I think for this disease particularly, we need to think about this from a global context and not just the US or European or high-income countries. When you think about sickle cell disease, the vast burden of this disease is in sub-Saharan Africa and India. Okay? The vast burden of this disease is in sub-Saharan Africa and India. Today, still, the number of young children that die with sickle cell disease is vast. And then thinking about genetic curative therapies, how do we balance that when we think about a disease? So I think that as part of this conversation that we talk about who will benefit and who will not, we must think about this question from a global context and not just a US context. This slide is from the National Academies of Science 2017 report on genome editing, where they identified 7 governance principles for human genome editing. And I highlight one of those that they highlighted, which is fairness. And I argued, I had the honor to go to the second human genome editing meeting in Hong Kong. And I argued that it's not fairness, it's actually equity that we need to be arguing. And that we need to be thinking about this from an equity context and a justice context. And that when we think about somatic gene editing, that we really need to put it into context, both the excitement and the innovation and the opportunity of these new therapies, but actually who will benefit and who will not. And how do we frame this work in a way to increase the number of people who will benefit? So, access to genetic curative therapies, the potential of genetic curative therapies to benefit disparity diseases in patients will depend on scientific innovation, industry priorities, provider knowledge, and costs. So I want to just walk through some strategies that I think are some strategies to address this issue, to making sure that genomic and precision medicine will benefit all. And I want to highlight a paper that my colleagues and I published in Nature Reviews Genetics, where it really lays out our institute's perspective on what we must do to actually increase the benefit. It's focused on diversity issues and prioritizing diversity in human genomics research, but we lay out a number of our efforts and steps that we've taken and that we plan to continue to take to tackle some of these issues. So I think, there's a recognition within the community that there's a lot to be done and that we must take these steps today. But we all have a place and a role to play in this. So I want to close with several suggestions that I have of how do we make the promise of precision medicine a reality. First, I would argue we need to use the electronic healthcare record as a tool for genomic medicine and equitable care, both from the perspective of providing better care to individual patients, but a way to monitor what's going on and monitor differences in treatment, that we really can use data that we have as a learning health system, as an approach, as a way of monitoring and making sure we highlight the gaps and disparities that we see in treatment, but also to help us with regards to providing better care to individual patients. I think the second is we need to support, and this is really from a research context, support the development of resources that adjust for diversity during analysis and interpretation. We need better tools to understand difference and variation and how we think about small population differences, that we need to create those tools in a way that can actually be beneficial. So really putting the efforts and energy on technology development that are going to help us with that process, I think is an important step that we must take. We need funded, targeted research initiatives. I am pleased that the National Human Genome Research Institute is leading the way in this area of recognizing that we need to require researchers to recruit specific populations where we are involved in participating. And if they can't do it, they can't get the funding. And so this ability to start to really build those bridges in a way to actually work with those communities that are now not at the level that they should be within our databases. And so engage with those communities. So our institute has targeted a number of our initiatives for under-resourced populations, for minority, racial, ethnic populations, for rural populations, for populations that are often left out of the research. Sustained community engagement, education, and partnership. We must continue to have dialogue and engagement with communities. We can't just go ask for their DNA and leave. We must understand and recognize their priorities and what they want and how to actually make sure that the research that we're conducting, the work that we're doing, is actually something that is of community interest and of community benefit. So with that, I just want to close to let you know that our institute is in the process of developing a strategic plan for 2020 for our institute. The National Human Genome Research Institute, from its very beginning, has had these strategic plans as milestones. leading the Human Genome Project for the United States, we had 5-year strategic plans on what was to be done by certain dates. And our institute has continued to do this type of approach to help guide and direct our research program. And so we are now in the midst of this process. I invite you to go to our website, to send in notes, your feedback, what you think needs to happen, what you think shouldn't happen, of how do we move forward in a way that can actually benefit everyone. So with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.
So we do have time for a few questions for Mr. Bonham. For those in the room, there's a microphone in front of you. Please hold down the button and, while you're asking your question so everybody in the audience can hear your question. That's the state grade. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question to follow up. You mentioned how we're trying to kind of separate the science from like the representation itself or the social component. But one of the issues that we have is the populations that we're lacking in all these databases are heavily underrepresented in science. They're not doing their research. So it's really hard to decouple that, especially if you're going to talk to these populations who have experienced so many injustices. So can you elaborate on what's currently being doing or how you're thinking about how to work? Those have to be, you know.
So I totally agree with you. I was going back and forth. Should I have 5 challenges or 4 challenges? How much time do I have? So they only gave me 35 minutes because my next challenge was really this workforce issue, which is a huge issue. And it continues to be a major issue around genomics research, around biomedical research more broadly, and around healthcare. And without having members of the community, people who are engaged from those communities, the perspective of the work is different. The perspective with regards to how they engage and work with the communities is different. And I think that it continues to be a major problem. I'm actually on Thursday giving a talk at the American Society of Human Genetics where that is the whole conversation about what can we do now. So our institute is doing a couple things right now. One is there's a recognition that this is a problem, and we are seeking in a variety of ways to work with our grantees, particularly our large grantees like this place, how can you bring in more people from underrepresented communities actually doing the science? And can we provide you additional funds to help you do that in a way that helps to develop that? So we have taken on an approach where we provide additional resources to grantees in helping to do that. We also are developing different training programs at different types of institutions across the country. So to reach out to different kinds of institutions to actually, how can we increase our workforce in that way? But I think the biggest issue is to put a spotlight on it. To put a spotlight on what the numbers look like, to what the challenges are, and help to develop plans on how do we build people to be able. And I think one of the challenges is the pipeline issue. That's the problem. But I argue that we also have this loss that happens right from graduate students to postdoc to those initial academic positions that we really need to put a highlight on. So there's a number of different programs at NIH that are taking on this issue. This continues to be a major issue, and I think it is a challenge related to ultimately precision medicine also.
Thanks so much for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a genetic counselor.
Yes.
And I'm on the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force of the National Society of Genetic Counselors, which just started. It's only a year-long task force. And what I'm thinking about is many things, but one is that the NSGC is such a small organization in comparison to some of these other genetics national organizations, and how we might be able to dialogue with some of the other organizations that have already endeavored on even just diversity statements. What kind of platform there could be for cross-organizational conversations about the same issues?
So two things. You're going to give me a card before you leave here. I'm going to take it to Mona at ASHG on Thursday when I give this talk. I actually think that would be a great thing, connecting Kathy Wicklund and some of the other folks I know within the genetic counseling. You know, this is, and actually I think genetic counseling is really one of the real problems, and because from a clinical perspective, it really is an outlier. So I'm happy to help be a bridge of bringing organizations together to talk about these issues and how working together. You know, and I think genetic counseling is I don't know how many, everybody knows it. It's a unique profession, and one that is a very small profession, and it's becoming so important with regards to clinical care. And then when you look at the diversity of it, there is none. I think I can count almost all of the African American genetic counselors in the country. And so it's a huge issue. So I am happy to help in any way I can, and helping bring the work that I do at the National Human Genome Research Institute to try to build some of those bridges to help. And I know it's been a major problem. I know it's been brought up at various times over the last 10 years. But I think now's the time to bring it up again in a different kind of way maybe. So let's talk.
So I guess with the rise of like voluntary participation or excitement in the public with things like 23andMe, where people are just getting more excited about learning about their own genes, but there's a lack of clarity on how that information is stored or shared, and possibly a skew towards those who are in more affluent populations that are actually able to participate in things like that. Could you just talk about how you think that kind of is pertinent to this discussion on equity and genomics?
So I think it's an important question, and there have been people who have been doing research in this area, and it's kind of interesting. You know, I don't know how much it's perceived as a problem or how much it is the problem. And most recently in the work that I've read, is that's not the primary issue of concern. It's much more about, I have limited time, I got to take the children to school, I got to get the health care or to do those kinds of things, to use it, are barriers and challenges versus these issues of concern with privacy. But I do think it's a continuing issue we need to raise and study. But actually the most recent studies are showing that's not the highest priority, why people are not participating. I know Dr. Landry, and she may talk about, some of the work that she's done with 23andMe and some of the other kind. We have all of us can maybe talk about kind of the perceptions and experiences they're having. So I think there's a variety of issues, and I think that there's an obligation that both for those companies as well as the government to do everything to protect the information. But I also think that there are other issues that are going on that may be barriers. So I know we don't have much time. Last question.
Thank you. Do you think there is an impact of fear about identifying genetic differences related to the historic specter of eugenics?
So, and I don't know if Marnie might go into that a little bit also. So I think how would I describe it? I think people recognize difference and intuitively understand difference. I think that the challenge is that difference does not fit into our social categories. And that is what creates this problem. When we use our concept of race and talk about difference, we know that that is not necessarily valid. So I would argue that we need to kind of tease these things apart. And this is why I see this as a challenge, the ability to communicate variation, and that we too often, in my opinion, talk about difference in a construct that does not necessarily fit scientific variation. So that we'll put a person in a group, you are black, this is what you are. but they understand from an ancestral background that they have a significant amount of European or American Indian blood and background and ancestral. So what does that mean? And so how we use these concepts is where I think we all have to work together in better ways to talk about and to communicate difference. So thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to transition now to our panelists. They're going to come up individually, but I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will introduce all of our panelists. I should know this bio by heart, given the individual who I'm introducing, but I want to bring up Dr. Latrice Landry. So when we were tasked with this, developing this equity and social justice lecture series, I was fortunate to have a personal relationship with an expert in the field, and she helped pull together not only our keynote speaker but our panelists. So Dr. Latrice Landry is a clinical genomics fellow at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and also at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she focuses on precision medicine and health disparities. She received her undergraduate training and graduate training at Tufts University, and she's focused on research on a number of large patient populations, including the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study, the Jackson Heart Study, so on and so forth. She is going to introduce our panelists, and our panelists will come to the microphone, give their presentations, and then afterwards we're going to hold questions for the individual panelists until all of their presentations, and we'll have them sort of here in the front where they can interact with the entire audience and answer questions. So with that, Dr. Landry.
Please excuse me, I've never had the opportunity to do this, but thank you, Dr. Landry, for that introduction. So welcome. I think this is going to be an exciting and engaging panel discussion. We have a very diverse group of panelists to speak with us today. I'd like to also thank you, Mr. Bonham, for his presentation and leading us through some frameworks in which we can think about this, thinking about different types of precision medicine in terms of diagnostics, therapeutics, targeted therapies, and also thinking about some of the challenges we have before us. Each of our panelists was selected based off of their expertise in this area. And as Dr. Landry mentioned, each one will come up and give you a short presentation to sort of introduce you to their, where they live in this precision medicine space. And then we'll open it up for all of us and Mr. Bonham to sit on a panel discussion to have a more free-flowing dialogue around these issues. So our first speaker will be Dr. Marnie Gelbart. Marnie is the Director of Programs for the Personal Genetics Education Project here at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Genetics. The goal of the Personalized Genetics Education Project is to engage the public in awareness and dialogue about the benefits as well as the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetic technologies. Dr. Gelbart's most recent initiatives have focused on organizing congressional briefings, as well as advising writers, producers of television and film, and working with communities of faith around workshops around personalized genetics, and also leading and educating teachers in both primary and secondary education around these issues. She leads a NIH Science Education Partnership Award Program, a 5-year award from NIH on engaging multiple communities and those in Massachusetts as well as South Dakota around topics around genetics. And the idea is to bring and integrate discussion on genetics in both the classrooms and in those communities. Marnie is a very gifted speaker in this topic, and she will help to address some of those historical issues that were mentioned before. Marnie, we look forward to your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Latrice, for that kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, speaking with Mr. Bonham and the panel of speakers here. As Latrice said, I'm based in the Department of Genetics here at Harvard Medical School, where we are really, my colleagues and I are so excited about the potential of the technologies that are coming out of genetic labs here at Harvard and around the world to improve healthcare, knowing that there's a lot of important work that needs to be done to make those technologies available to all and to make sure that these technologies are not widening the gap between the haves and have-nots, and really appreciate, Vence, your comments this morning about strategies for how we can do better. I'm also speaking from the Personal Genetics Education Project, where our lens on social justice is really thinking about equity across all communities and access to information about genetic technologies, so that our communities are aware about the choices that they're facing, better prepared to make informed decisions, whether they want to use genetic technologies in their lives or whether they choose not to, and that the voices of our communities are heard, the concerns are heard by researchers. So I will just, Vence, it was such a great introduction. I think I can just go through these slides fairly quickly, but just to ground these conversations in what the field of genetics is making possible. So when the Human Genome Project was completed, that the first sequence of the human genome took over 13 years, cost $3 billion. Today, consumers can get access to their whole genome sequence for under $1,000, and the exact price point depends on if you want that information interpreted or just a long list of ACs, Gs, and Ts. But it's very clear to our colleagues that this technology will not be accessible to everyone unless the cost keeps coming down, and so there are many researchers who are working to make the cost of genome sequencing free. Vence talked about pharmacogenetics, that our bodies metabolize medications differently. And so here I give another example of how a person's genetic information can inform healthcare decisions. Here talking about the drug codeine, a pain reliever, which our bodies metabolize into morphine, and genetic variation in another CYP gene, CYP2D6, can influence how efficiently our bodies metabolize the drug. So in this room, there's probably a few of us, if we take codeine for pain, say after a dental procedure, who would experience very little pain relief. There are people who metabolize, whose CYP2D6 variants predispose them to slowly metabolizing the drug, whereas, and so for them, they don't experience much therapeutic relief from codeine. Even more concerning is people who are rapid metabolizers of codeine into morphine, and if these individuals are given codeine, they can experience very severe and even life-threatening reactions. And so an individual who goes into their doctor, when their doctor asks if you have any family history of allergy to codeine, it's a very important question. Somebody mentioned 23andMe. People are increasingly have access to their genetic information through tests that are available online that can give a range of information, whether it's risk for disease, carrier testing for the variants that they can pass on to their children, learning about their genetic contributions, their family story, their ancestry, and other traits. And this is as people think about whether to participate in this, questions about privacy, questions about how when they submit their samples, who will have access to their genetic information, whether in the context of research or, since the forgetting the name, but how their information might be available to law enforcement. And last week we heard from Family Tree DNA that has made public a relationship that they have with the FBI for processing samples from certain very violent crimes, and then the law enforcement would be able to compare those samples to other samples in their database. Genetic genome sequencing is also making advances in prenatal tests that are increasingly becoming the standard of care, particularly for patients of advanced maternal age. And so these technologies are making it possible to learn about the genetic makeup of a fetus from a sample of blood from the pregnant person's arm. And Mr. Bonham also talked about the prospects of genetic therapies and very early but promising results last week about how gene therapies might one day be used as a treatment for sickle cell disease, and also, I need some water. In addition to concerns about access, there are major concerns about the history of mistrust and who will participate in clinical trials. And I think that Dr. Jackson will talk about some of the historical abuses in medical experimentation that have been experienced in a number of marginalized communities in the field of genetics. We're particularly aware of our history of eugenics where flawed genetic arguments were used to justify what was thought to be superiority of some groups over others, and starting in 1927 and going through the 1970s, at least 66,000 people were forcibly sterilized because they thought that would be for the societal benefit. And so as this new wave of genetic technologies comes out into the world, we feel a commitment to do much better in making sure our communities are informed. Okay, so, that keeps flickering. So at the Personal Genetics Education Project, our mission is to raise awareness and increase dialogue about the benefits and the ethical and societal implications of genetic technologies across all communities, so individuals are confident to ask questions and to make informed decisions about their genetic information. So I work with a really amazing group of people. Shown here, we're based in the lab of Dr. Ting Wu, who runs a genetic lab. Many of us work here at Harvard Medical School. My colleague Dana is up in Maine, and Vika and Florcy run programs out of Fields Corner, because it became apparent pretty quickly that to engage our communities, while we could pretty easily get a group of people together from affluent communities in and around Boston, that it was much harder for us to engage with the communities closest to us. And so we operate on the principles that we need to meet our communities where they are and talk about the issues and concerns that are most relevant to them. So what do? I'll just say really briefly, we go to schools, to community groups, and we talk about genetics, both the potential good that genetics can do for people, but also the ethical, the personal, familial, and social implications of genetic information. We work with teachers, and so we've developed a number of lesson plans for people to think about how genetics is entering their world, and we talk about topics that are relevant to people, so how they may be seeing genetics in the clinic, the consumer market, but also concerns about the history of eugenics, how genetic information might be used in law enforcement. We travel around the country to train teachers, so that teachers, whether they're from science or history or English, health, can bring these conversations about genetics into their classrooms. We work with writers and producers of television and film. As Latrice says, we do congressional briefings so that we can inform policymakers. The these genetic technologies are moving so much faster than conversations in the communities and also at the level of how policymakers will regulate them. And my last slide is communities of faith. So as I said before, it's really clear that the challenges that we have in engaging our communities and sometimes just showing up in a community where you don't know anything about the circumstances of their life is offensive. And so we reached out a few years ago to leaders from some faith communities. We've worked with Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities asking for their help because they have the trust of their communities, particularly in disenfranchised communities. And so we have been working with them, and here's one of the groups we've worked with, the Minority Coalition for Precision Medicine, the group of pastors that have come together around concerns about diseases that are particularly prevalent in their African American community, particularly sickle cell disease. And to say the first time Michael and Shakir invited us to Baltimore for a meeting, and when we got there we were expecting 200 pastors and there was less than 10 people in the room. And they at first were polite about why, but then as the conversation got going, they said, you know, people from institutions like yours, they come, they get what they need, and then they leave. And so, well, a lot of people didn't show up that day, but there's something amazing about a small group of people and powerful conversations that you can have. And we decided to get together again, and we had a follow-up meeting here in Boston the following spring. And, you know, the rapport that we're building with groups is fragile, it takes time, but we're continuing these conversations so that their communities can have the information that they are looking for. So with that, I will end and pass it back to Latrice.
Marnie, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. As mentioned, we will have each of the panelists present and engage in dialogue and discussions at the end of the panel presentations. Next, I would like to introduce Jonathon Jackson, Dr. Jonathon Jackson, who is the director of the Community Access Recruitment and Engagement Care Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. CARE investigates the impact of diversity and inclusion on the quality of human subjects research and leverages deep community engagement and entrenchment to build trust and overcome barriers to clinical trial participation. His research focuses on midlife and late life health disparities in the clinical setting that affect underserved populations. Dr. Jackson also works as a cognitive neuroscientist investigating the early detection of Alzheimer's disease, particularly in the absence of overt memory problems. He has become a well-known representative to underserved communities and dozens of affiliated organizations, particularly regarding participation in clinical research. Dr. Jackson serves on the leadership team of several organizations focused on community health and has written guidance for local, statewide, and national groups on research access, engagement, and recruitment. Please, a warm welcome for Dr. Jonathon Jackson.
All right, good morning, everyone. I don't have slides today because in a previous life I was an expert on mind wandering, and so I know better than to have some kind of competing distraction behind me, especially presented times 4. So I'm just going to be talking at you for the next 10 minutes, and hopefully we can get into some juicy conversation and debate as we move forward. So that said, again, mind-wandering researcher, I know there's stuff going on here, but please just try to focus as much as you can on what I say. If you get about 40% of it, you're right on track for most adults. So good luck in listening to me for the next approximately 4 out of the next 10 minutes. So what I want to talk to you today is trying to present the information that we've discussed previously with Dr. Gelbart and with the Associate Director in context. And so namely that context is one from a historical perspective. So we need to recognize that there are these key ethics examples that we need to kind of inject into this conversation so that we understand the magnitude of the work that we're doing, especially as it moves forward. So a quick show of hands. Who's heard of Henrietta Lacks? Okay, all right, good, great start. Who here has heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study? All right, again, almost everyone. Wonderful. Who here has heard of the Havasupai Native American population in the Grand Canyon? We're losing some hands here. Okay. Who here has heard of Vertus Hardeman? A single individual from Lyles Station, Indiana. Almost no one. Who knows what Columbia University did in 1997 with regards to genetic information? So the point that I'm trying to draw here is that there are a couple of examples that we like to cite as being like the canonical examples, but we often mistake them to be exhaustive. So one of the things that I often do, especially in the month of February, is I like to outline a number of medical abuses and atrocities that have happened, particularly to underserved populations. In particular, we're referring to Native populations, Latinx populations, Black American populations, and prisoner populations. So historically, when we conducted human subjects research, we did it on communities of convenience, whoever was the easiest to come by. And in those days, those populations were the ones that didn't have the opportunity to speak up or speak out. They were the ones who were silenced either by systems or by the design of the research study. We like to think that we're beyond those days, but if I'd like to make a bit of a bold argument, I would say that we still largely rely on samples of convenience for human subjects research. It's just that those samples look a little bit different these days than they did back in the 1920s, the 1960s, the 1990s. And so we need to think about the ethical implications of large databases of information when we are leaving some people out of the equation. So we've repeatedly blurred the line between clinical research and clinical care. For those of us who are on the research side, we have that bright line. This is clinical care, this is clinical research. And we don't violate it except when we do, which is pretty frequent. And so we need to recognize that that blurred line has cost us tremendously in the past. And to simply say that we're doing these advances in the name of public good is to erase, silence, and ignore a lot of the history of what's come before. So we often assume that these same harms, the same things that happened in Tuskegee, the same things that happened in Columbia University in 1997, the same things that happened just a few years ago with the Havasupai, we assume that they can't happen again because there are ethics policies that have been put in place. We've got the Belmont Commission and its attendant report published in the 1970s. We have ethics regulations and guidance from the Atomic Energy Commission that was put in place in the 1950s. Again, we have these policies in place and we assume that that serves as an effective substitute for thinking about the ethical implications of the work that we're doing. But again, I would like to posit the humble suggestion that that is not enough. So we have to recognize, and this is really hard in New England where we don't like talking about these things, it's hard to recognize that our intent is not enough. Our intent is insufficient to solve these issues. And just if you think about it from a scientific perspective, thank you, if we had really good intent to have a robust statistical analysis, but we didn't really do the work, would we expect full credit? Would we expect that the peer review, that granting agencies, that our fellow colleagues would assume that that work was enough? We probably wouldn't. If we were working with a pharmaceutical company and we said we really intended the study to be done on time and on budget, but it wasn't, we still tried, right? What would the monitor say? What would that company say? So we need to be careful that we're not making the same excuses and that we're held to the same level of rigor for any other aspect of our protocols. In terms of gathering the data, storing the data, asking research questions, interrogating the data, and finally returning results to the people who provided the data to us in the first place. Our intent is insufficient. And so this actually goes back to the Associate Director's, one of the points that you made, Mr. Bonham, which is how do we balance the difference between thinking about diversity as an avenue towards social justice versus making it an integral part of our scientific workflow. There's value to both of those things, but we need to keep in mind that one is not the substitute for the other, and that to make a meaningful difference, we have to advance both agendas simultaneously. All right, so moving ahead, we've talked a little bit about some of the highlights in the news recently, so I won't go over there, retread some of those things. But what I want to think about is why certain groups are being excluded now and what we can do about it. We often talk about trying to engage with specific communities. We often talk about trying to sustain the work that we do. We talk about trying to improve the diversity of our workforce. However, we haven't thought about moving outside of the existing workflows, moving outside of the existing workforce entirely. So, for example, if we're talking about the harvesting of large amounts of genetic information, there needs to be a public education campaign. We need to make sure that we have a diverse and inclusive workforce interrogating the data for us. But we haven't thought about other avenues of research to engage populations. For example, what if we allowed these communities to own the data that they're providing? How might that change the research enterprise if it was in the hands of communities? It would require us to create more sustainable, reciprocal partnerships because we did not have the data. We would need to seek permission. We would need to make sure there was a clear return of value. We would need to integrate these individuals deeply into our research protocols, into secondary analyses. But if that feels uncomfortable, we need to understand why that feels uncomfortable. Does it seem reasonable to allow communities, individuals, neighborhoods to own the data that we're using to develop our scientific questions? Does it seem reasonable to allow these communities to devise the scientific questions, to put our resources into these areas so that they can become individual research entities? The radical idea of the democratization of research is one that needs to be at the heart of the work that we're talking about today. Because without it, we're likely to rely on trust, which is equivalent to having these communities have faith in us. And given the history of genetic medicine, given the history of what we have done in numerous communities in the United States and as well as outside of it, I'm not sure we're at the point where we need to be talking about trust as much as we should be talking about empowerment. And in order to empower these communities, the communities that are often silenced, we need to recognize that we have to give up our own power. We might think that our intent is enough. We might think that sustained community engagement is enough, but ultimately we need to redirect resources, power, agency into underserved communities and populations. It's the only way we're going to make this work. Otherwise, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. And one thing that I would ask all of you to do is to remember some of those examples that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the ones that you hadn't heard of. Go back and research Virtus Hardeman. Think about what Columbia University did in 1997. It's actually quite relevant to the discussions we're having today. Think about the greater context of the Tuskegee syphilis study, of the Havasupai population down at the Grand Canyon, to think about how much of what happened to Henrietta Lacks is still permissible within our research enterprise today. And only in understanding all of these things, we can really understand the best way forward and to make sure that the research that we're doing moving ahead is as inclusive as possible. So I believe that's my time. I'm happy to get into a few more of these details during the Q&A section, but thanks for about 40% of your attention.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that presentation. Next, we will have Dr. Jordan Smoller, who will, next we'll have Dr. Paul Underwood, who is representing or coming to us from Boston Scientific. Dr. Underwood received his medical degree from Mayo Clinic and followed it by his cardiology fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic. His interventional cardiology training was completed at the Iowa Heart Center in Des Moines, and he has practiced interventional cardiology and clinical research in Phoenix for over 18 years. Dr. Underwood has been actively involved in community-based efforts focused on promoting cardiovascular health. He is the president of the Association of Black Cardiologists and founding member of the Center for African American Health in Arizona. He served the American Heart Association's Desert Mountain affiliate, as well as a nationally on the Women and Minority Leadership Committee. The Power to End Stroke Advisory Committee, and the Science Advisory and Coordinating Committee. At Boston Scientific, Dr. Underwood recently received the Interventional Cardiology Business Unit Diversity Award for his work with Platinum Diversity Trial and the first interventional cardiology study to focus solely on women and minorities. In 2015, he also received the Chairperson's Award from the National Forum for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention. He is currently the medical director for the Interventional Cardiology Structural Heart franchise and a member of Close the Gap, Boston Scientific's Health Equity and Education Initiative. We welcome Dr. Underwood. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Landry, for that wonderful introduction, and certainly it's an honor to be here before you today. I feel kind of like a fish out of water as a person from industry coming to speak with you, but I think we share many things in common. First and foremost, I was a practicing physician for about 25 years, and so I have a lot of clinical experience, particularly in clinical research. And then about 9 years ago or so, I joined Boston Scientific largely through the clinical research to help with product development and in terms of maintaining the products, making sure they stay on the market. So diversity in clinical trials has been a concern of mine as an investigator, as well as now from the sponsor standpoint. What I want to do is share with you some of the things that we've done with Boston Scientific to try to come about improving diversity in our clinical trials. Let me see how this works. So what we did was develop an app that we could use to kind of open up the conversation with hospitals. And I'll just go through this very quickly with you. What it can do is look at the hospitals, say, which are pretty much our accounts, and then it calculates the catchment area around them. It also maps to a heat map that lets us know coronary artery disease prevalence in those particular zip codes. The data that we use comes from the National Minority Quality Forum, and then also from MedPAR data, which is like Medicare, Medicaid type data, and it also is backed up with census data. So we'll have within a population, which happens to be the zip codes, we'll know the demographics, whether they're white, non-white, men or women, and then we also have estimated prevalences of coronary artery disease. Then we can look at that particular hospital, and so in this particular case where the little hearts are indicate where where coronary disease, or excuse me, indicate the catchment area for this particular hospital. This happens to be in Tallahassee. And then what we did is index to white males in terms of looking at treatment rates that we had from the Medicare data to understand who in that hospital has been treated for coronary disease, in particular stents. So Boston Scientific is a manufacturer of stents. We're very concerned with people having access to percutaneous coronary intervention. And so looking at the data, we can say that this is the rate that this particular hospital treated white males. that came to their hospital with coronary problems, and then what would happen if you compared it to other people within their catchment area. So this is the rate looking at white women and then non-white males and females here. And then based on the prevalence rates, we can see if there are any gaps that exist. And in this particular case, we can see that there are these gaps that come out in yellow of what would be expected in terms of treatment versus what actually took place. And with this in mind, we can then talk to the hospitals about what they can do to try to help to improve their ability to access or have everyone access health care at that institution. So oftentimes it would be going into diverse populations and then understanding based on the catchment area and the risk map. We'll find certain zip codes that may be more important for them to look at. Other times it's looking at gender issues, certainly now in February, which is the Heart Month and the Go Red for Women campaign. Issues of gender disparity and cardiovascular disease are very important. So we can initiate programs to go into either the community to educate people about what they need to do to come in to seek care for cardiovascular disease, or actually go to the practitioners themselves to make sure that they understand some of the nuances that occur in people who have cardiovascular disease. So with this, we can say that for them, there's an opportunity to access more people if they're able to actually access more of the communities. And we work with the different hospitals to see what they come up with their plans to access the community. Last week I was in Los Angeles at White Memorial Hospital, and that's in it's East Los Angeles, which is a very Latino population. So they have certain approaches. They're very concerned with childhood obesity. Certainly language is a problem as well. So they've developed programs within that hospital to try to be bilingual, certainly, and to start trying to address people, particularly in their middle age, about what they can do about obesity in their children. So getting back to Boston Scientific, this is just a screenshot of one of our clinical trial management systems. So we use this to manage clinical trials. I think we have around 125 clinical trials that are ongoing pretty much all the time. And with this, you can see the sites that we have, the trials here to the far left. And then what we'll do is look at, say, the number of patients enrolled, the average query age, and then protocol deviations per patient. So these are typical performance metrics that we look at when we engage our sites. And so if you happen to be one of our sites, you'll know that our project managers are always on you to try to reduce the protocol deviations, to try to hasten your query response, and we certainly want you to enroll on time. But what we also did was map the demographics pages to this database as well, so that we can see, again, white, non-white, and then gender enrollment per site. And with this, we'll know if we're getting a diverse representation of their patient population. And so what we're doing moving forward is looking at the data that are presented first in terms of what the community demographics are, what the treatment demographics at that hospital are, and what is actually being enrolled in our clinical trials. And with that, we're able to go to a site and say that, we really want clinical trial enrollment that's representative of the patients that you treat. And so we'd want to make sure that there's some match between what is actually actual there and what's expected to occur in terms of enrollment. And then we also want the hospital to be concerned with what's going on in their neighborhoods, so making sure that they're able to go out and collect those patients that are potentially there that are not quite meeting the system. And our goal is that, of course, we get to have patients come in, and then once they're in, to actually get them enrolled. So with that, I'll leave it open for questions, and I'll see you after the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. We specifically designed this panel to include those from industry, academia, and government. So we look forward to all of these perspectives. Next, I will introduce Dr. Jordan Smoller, who is a psychiatrist and epidemiologist and geneticist here at Harvard, whose research focuses on, one, understanding genetic and environmental determinants of psychiatric disorders across the lifespan, two, integrating genomics and neuroscience to unravel how genes affect brain structure and function, and three, using big data, including electronic health records and genomics, to advance precision medicine. Dr. Smoller is the Massachusetts General Hospital Trustee Endowed Chair in Psychiatric Neuroscience, Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and Professor in the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health here in Boston. He is an Associate Chief for Research at Massachusetts General Hospital in the Department of Psychiatry and the Director of both the Psychiatric and Neurodevelopmental Genetic Unit and the Precision Medicine Research Unit at Mass General Hospital Center for Genomic Medicine. Dr. Smoller is a Tepper Family MGH Research Scholar and also serves as Director of the Omics Unit at MGH and the Co-Director of Partners Healthcare Biobank here as a part of Partners Healthcare. He is an associate member of the Broad Institute and Vice President of the International Society of Psychiatric Genetics. He's a PI for the Electronic Medical Records and Genomics eMERGE study, network and contact PI for the New England Precision Medicine Consortium and part of the NIH Precision Medicine Initiative's All of Us research program. He's an author of more than 300 scientific publications and is also the author of The Other Side of Normal. We welcome Dr. Smoller.
Thank you, Latrice, and thanks for including me today. This is just an extraordinarily important discussion, and I think we've heard some really important perspectives, so I expect our panel discussion will be very engaging. What I want to do is talk with you a little bit about the All of Us research program, which how many people here have heard of the All of Us research program? Many, but not all. Okay, good. We heard from Mr. Bonham, I think, a beautiful overview of some of the issues that we are confronting if we're going to advance precision medicine and improve inclusion and diversity in research. And we heard in the presentations that followed, thank you, terrific, some of the challenges that we face, and from Dr. Jackson, some of the historical challenges. What I want to talk a little bit about is what are some of the opportunities from the future, and in particular, how does the All of Us program potentially contribute to that? So let's see if I can work this. So the All of Us, the All of Us program is part of the NIH Precision Medicine Initiative, which really kind of got its start in President Obama's 2015 State of the Union address. He said, "My hope is that this becomes the foundation, the architecture, whereby in 10 years from now, we can look back and say that we have revolutionized medicine." So a very ambitious goal. And as a result of that kind of initiative, the All of Us research program was ultimately launched with the goal of accelerating health research and medical breakthroughs, enabling individualized prevention, treatment, and care for all of us. And it is the cornerstone of this precision medicine initiative. It's been allocated funds from the 21st Century Cures Act that will extend over a decade. And the ambitious goal, in maybe the best sense of the word, is to enroll 1 million or more Americans reflecting the broad diversity of our country. There are going to be opportunities for volunteers to provide data on an ongoing basis. And the idea is that this will be a platform for precision medicine research in all kinds of areas for decades to come. So I want to tell you a little bit about what's involved and also what we're doing here locally in Boston. One of the central core values, and in fact, an essential, in some ways, reason for being for this study is to make sure that we are representing the diversity of the country. In many ways, specifically because of the issue that Mr. Bonham highlighted, there has been a fairly dramatic underrepresentation of many communities, and the risk that with the advances that we're seeing in precision medicine, folks will be left behind in terms of advances or are knowing whether certain things are going to help or contribute to health. So the All of Us research program has this kind of real emphasis on diversity, not just by ancestry, but also things like geography, spreading across the country, urban versus rural, a diversity of data types, a diversity of health status, and so on. The program is ambitious in terms of the kinds of data that are being collected. So it's begun with participant surveys, electronic health records, physical measurements, which to date are relatively limited, mostly anthropometric measurements, biosamples that include blood and urine samples, mobile wearable technologies, geospatial environmental data, and the notion is that this may actually expand as the years go on. The core values, which really are, and I can tell you as somebody who has participated deeply in the program, these are the things that we are constantly talking about. Participation is open to interested individuals. What that means is that anybody can join the program. So what I'll show you is that some of the enrollment in this program is through health provider organizations, but a big part of the enrollment is also as direct volunteers. So folks who are not necessarily connected to a health provider organization or are in regions where there isn't an organization participating in the program can also sign up. The program is going to reflect the diversity of America. Participants will be partners in the program. I'll say a little bit more about that. Trust through robust engagement and full transparency. Access to information in a way that has really not been done in most research studies. Return of information. If we have it, essentially you can have it. Data from the program will be broadly accessible to empower research, not just by certain academic institutions, but citizen science as well. Privacy and trust principles and data security, which is always an issue that we're talking about, and catalyzing innovative programs and policies. The value of participating in the program, which is something that we try to articulate to people who are interested in the program, is potentially several-fold. One is that you may learn more about your own health status or indicators because there is return of information. Obviously, the important mission of fighting disease and improving health for future generations, and then ensuring that your community is included in studies. This is sort of the social justice and equity aspect of this, which is crucially important, and being part of a movement, being part of something that is potentially going to change the game. So those are some of the core things that we hope people will see as valuable about participating. I mentioned that participants are really partners, not subjects, and to sort of instantiate this, participants are represented on all of the communities and panels and designing aspects of the study. We have our own community advisory panels here in Boston that are guiding the work that we're doing here as well. And I won't go through this in detail, but the notion is that if you have a resource, a data platform and resource that is of this scale and scope, the potential for scientific discovery is large. And not simply in genomics or pharmacogenomics, but in many other aspects as well, in terms of community engagement, mobile health technologies, development of biomarkers, and so on. So the hope is that this will be a platform that continues to pay dividends in terms of discovery for a long time. Data sharing is a core principle of the program and is a priority. And so the notion is that data will be broadly shared with obviously consent of all participants who are participating, and there are extensive privacy and safety security standards that are in place. We could talk about that further in the panel discussion if folks are interested. So this is kind of the inaugural national network of participating partners involved in the enrollment and engagement in this program. You can see spread out around the country. I'll note that the New England Precision Medicine Consortium is up there, and that's the work that we're doing here locally, and that's a collaboration of Partners Healthcare System, which of course has many hospitals in this area, Mass General, the Brigham, Newton Wellesley, community health centers, and Boston Medical Center, and its HealthNet network and community health centers as well. So we are aiming to enroll and engage nearly 100,000 individuals in the Boston area. And this is just a sort of a representation of some of our enrollment sites around the area, and you can see that we are in many places and working with many communities. So the program actually launched in May of 2018. There are more than 100,000 folks who have really completed the initial components of the program. There are, I've focused on the promise. There are certainly challenges, and I think that's a focus of what we're talking about today. One of them that we confront in a study like this in particular is the digital divide, because much of the, in fact, essentially all of the enrollment process involves some kind of connection with digital technology or digital communication. And as one might expect, different communities are differently connected digitally. And this is something that's a challenge that I think we are still trying to confront. How do we overcome the fact that there are disparities in digital communication and in our ability to engage? Building trust and overcoming fear is one that highlights, I think, the work that Jonathon talked about. We've been fortunate to have Jonathon on the team informing our efforts as well. But this is a real concern that we build meaningful trust, meaningful engagement, not a simple one-way kind of interaction. Articulating the value proposition. What are the things that communicate that participation is valuable, sustaining engagement, again, not simply engaging with a community and then, a couple of years later informing folks of what's gone on, but really building a reciprocal relationship that is sustained. And that is also something that is challenging, in part because of some of the mistrust and concern that folks have with understandable reason because of past experience. And then retention. Engaging people is important up front, but for example, we're setting up email addresses for folks in some cases who don't have them. What's the likelihood that people will connect that way in the future if they haven't been previously? So I actually welcome suggestions and input from this group to help us think about these challenges, because this really is one of those opportunities, I think, that doesn't come around all that often for us to do something differently. And I think there's a tremendous desire to do that. So I'll just end by letting you know, if you want to participate in the study itself or just want to learn more about it, you can go to the website where there's a lot of this material. You can also call us here locally. We're also very interested in expanding our workforce here locally and making sure that we are representative of the community as well. And so if folks want to get involved in the program itself, in terms of how we do it here in Boston or be part of the effort, I would also welcome your following up with me. So I'm going to leave it there and look forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Smoller. So now I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their chairs to the other side of the table so we can face the audience. We're going to get started on our panel discussion just shortly. I'd like to set a few ground rules. So we like to embrace Harvard etiquette, Southern charm, and Minnesota niceness in this dialogue. So just remember your manners. And then also we want to just sort of remember and sort of highlight the scope of what we're talking about here. So we have experts here who are talking about, who are experts in precision medicine, genomic medicine, personalized medicine. I'll talk about that in one second. Education, science, and practice, right? And so we're talking about the full scope of precision medicine here. I also just want to state that for the purpose of our panel discussion, and I got permission from all of our panelists about this, the terms precision medicine, personalized medicine, and genomic medicine will be used interchangeably. If you don't like that, feel free to ask a question about it. All right, with that, we'll get started. Again, just to remind you of how your microphones work. At each of your desks, there's a microphone. If you hold down the button in front, it will turn green. You need to hold the button down throughout your question for the audience to be able to hear you. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel discussion. My first question is for Dr. Gelbart. Dr. Gelbart, thank you so much for including the faith-based communities. That's like really unique. They are stakeholders that are often forgotten in science, so I appreciate that. But my question is, in regards to personalized medicine, for example, CAR-T, it costs about $400,000. How would you scale it, and how would you make sure like a marginalized population have access to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing up that point of access. It's a huge point. I'm not sure if I have the answers for how you scale that. I think could be other people in the panel have better, except to say that I think the cost, if it goes down, and the goal is for the cost to go down, is then for people to have information about where barriers of fear are not keeping people away from those technologies. But I think you're right that the cost is a huge barrier right now. I don't know if, Vence, you have anything to add about that?
I guess one comment I would make is that I think that there's a responsibility right now for us from a policy perspective to also think about how do we assess who gets access. So thinking about Medicaid, Medicare, thinking about different types of delivery systems, approaches to make sure that there's equitable access, about who really needs it, who can benefit, and how we make decisions. And then there's a larger issue that our country is struggling with about costs, more generally with regards to healthcare, that I think we're going to have to continue to have to help with regards to these new innovations in treatment.
Hi, to piggyback on Abear's comment, is there any advocacy for biosimilars in order to sort of tackle the gap? So if you don't have access to the drug itself, I think there's been push for biosimilars in order to find something that's more of a generic type drug that can also accomplish the same thing. Is there anything being done on that?
So certainly there is some work in biosimilars. Typically when drugs are developed, then that company has put quite a bit into developing that, and there are certain limitations on how it's going to be shared. But now there is quite a bit of work looking at biosimilar research. Typically the compounds may not be exactly the same. They may be very, very small differences, and those differences could be important. So understanding how they're made, how they're produced, and then how they're going to be distributed is very important. But I think it's key that more people use this, that they're aware of this, and that there's a demand, because that demand will also drive competition, and that will eventually lead to some reduction in cost as well.
Hi, my name is Shauna Anderson, and I'm actually from Sanofi. I am not on the pricing side of things. I actually design clinical trials. But I will say that when it comes to the pricing, and when it comes to, I completely agree that there is quite a bit that goes into getting these drugs to market. And so unfortunately, and I don't know if that will change, I think you're right, demand and policy will have to play a role in whether or not how the patent lives are determined, how the length of those times, and how the decisions are made in terms of how patents are extended. Because I think currently that's where barriers lie in terms of whether or not biosimilars and or generics can actually come to the market and when they can come to the market. But I will caution that, you know, unless the price of getting these drugs to market in the first place somehow is also, you know, tempered, that companies will not invest to get some of these drugs to market. And that's particularly important to me because I work in rare disease. So there really is no financial benefit to companies whatsoever for what I do. This is purely in many cases, it is a humanitarian cost that comes in addition to everything else that the companies do. A lot of the other drugs, the cardiovascular drugs, that funds in many ways what I can do. However, because there are so few people who benefit from it, the price tag tends to get quite high for when those drugs come to market. So I think it's a very complex issue, but policy, demand, and then also, you know, what is the time and the cost related to getting these drugs out there? Those are all things that have to play a role.
Sorry, I just wanted to offer one last comment. So in my kind of home area of expertise, which is less about kind of talking about disparities in access and more in terms of neurology, we know that the promise and the advent of AI is potentially one solution to some of these tricky, thorny issues. So at the latest conference that we have every July, we talked about AI kind of simulating some elements and starting to automate some parts of the drug discovery process and to try to simulate the underlying etiology of various diseases to look for common factors, which is a way forward in the rare disease space. Obviously, if you can kind of clump a bunch of diseases together by underlying etiology, then it becomes a little bit easier to justify the cost of investing. But it also potentially may make it a little bit more accessible or appealing, because if you can find that underlying etiology, then you can simulate or replicate a number of biosimilars, and then you have to talk about maybe the transfer of patent to, instead of like a particular mechanism, to the underlying AI technology, and whether that can be potentially licensed to kind of mine this underlying etiology for additional biosimilar therapies. So I think that is going to be one of the waves of the future to try to understand this. Now, it depends on how this mechanism is ultimately deployed or weaponized by different companies or academics, whether we can come up with like a fair and equitable licensing scheme for something like this. But that may be the way forward.
Dr. Jackson?
Yes.
So you had mentioned a couple of cases where everybody was raising their hands if they had heard about the bad clinical practices, I guess, with regards to genetics. And there were two cases at the end that pretty much no one raised their hands for.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could quickly just tell us what those, a little bit more about those.
Oh, sure. Very quickly. So, okay, I think there were three that I mentioned that people hadn't really talked about. The one that I saw a couple of hands was the Havasupai. So this is an indigenous tribe that lives pretty much at the base of the Grand Canyon. So they're one of the most remote Native American populations that we know of. So in the early 2000s, around 2002, 2003, they worked with the University of Arizona, I think, or was it Arizona State? It was Arizona State University, where they worked with just a small number of investigators and to try to understand the huge health disparities in that group related to diabetes 2. So they just had this absolutely insane rate of diabetes 2 in their population, almost wiped out a generation back in the 60s and 70s. So that consent form contained kind of broad language that was translated to kind of vaguely consent for additional research. And what happened was researchers at Arizona State also went on to look for evidence of the group's kind of ancestry, which violated their cultural beliefs. They also went on to look for evidence of inbreeding. They looked for evidence of mental illness. Now, there was not individual consent given to each of these areas. There was kind of this broad consent that was not well understood by the leadership of the tribe. And so what happened was it severely damaged the relationship between, I think, most scientists and native populations. The second one that I wanted to very quickly talk about was Columbia University in 1997. They had basically a very clear consent form where they unsealed the juvenile court records of individuals who were convicted of various crimes and then contacted their siblings. Their siblings, who were usually like 9 or 10 or 11, to see if there was any kind of predisposition to future crime. White people were specifically excluded from this study, and all of this was approved by the local IRB. And so this was just over 20 years ago. So these things are still happening. The last thing that I want to talk to you about was Vertus Hardeman, who was part of a small cohort of children. Actually, this was done to thousands of children all over the United States. Their heads were irradiated to kind of look at the effects of radiation on skull bones and skull fractures. His family was told that the doctors were treating ringworm, which was obviously not true. And if you look up pictures of Vertus Hardeman, there's actually a documentary of him that was published about 10 years ago called A Hole in the Head, because for the remaining 70 years of his life, his skull bones slowly dissolved, exposing brain tissue every day of his life. So this is just a kind of a handful of some of the examples where we thought we had ethical guidelines to cover some of this stuff. We still, kind of clever researchers still managed to find a way around it. So we need to realize that the systems that we have designed are not sufficient to address some of these more complicated issues.
So I wanted to ask the panel if each of you or whoever could speak a little more about what the US government could do on a federal level to protect citizens' privacy. So something like the European GDPR, for example.
So I think it's important for us to watch what's happening in Europe with regards to those regulations and how they're getting integrated, and can we learn from that in a way that can actually improve protection within the United States. So I think that's one step. I think also we just need to continue to develop the technology of approaches of how we're protecting information, and then transparency with regards to when there's breaches, and a way to make sure that the public understands the limitations that we all have with regards to our privacy.
Yeah, so I would add that, one is that our genetic information right now in the United States is protected by use in health insurance and employers. So in health insurance, to dictate coverage or how much to charge for coverage for employers, basis of hiring and firing decisions, so that there is some level of protection now. I think there's some consideration of whether those protections should be expanded for other areas, life insurance, and so forth. To think about, and I think what Vence said about the focus on the informing part. I think, when I listen to some of the examples that you give, Dr. Jackson, that there are scenarios of bad actors, but there's also scenarios where we think society maybe has, consensus says that we've done well, but that we, how will it look in 50 years from now? That the gold standard of informed consent, will that still hold up? So just challenge ourselves to really think about, for as transparent as we think the language is, as accessible as it is, that if that really, that information is understood in the way that we think it is, and that communities will they feel that every effort has been made for them to be informed to make these decisions.
Okay, so I think you wanted to hear from all the panelists. We'll try to quickly go. I've got some strong opinions on this, but and I think Jordan's heard a number of them already. I think the only solution is to codify some return of the actual data to non-academic sources. We have to give the data to communities and allow them to develop oversight and partnerships so that they can sort of be in better charge of how that information works. So in the case of Henrietta Lacks and the Havasu Pi, we see that these are limited examples of how that data can be protected and overseen. We need to kind of copy those examples and expand them along with the laws that Dr. Gelbart talked about, like specifically GINA, the Genetics Information Non-Discrimination Act, which talks about how employers and certain insurance, but not all insurance, cannot discriminate against you on the basis of this information. But we also need to think very long and hard about what happens, not if, but when data gets leaked, especially if that data becomes identifiable, because we're digitizing this to make it a little bit easier for us to all come in collection to, but we have to recognize that we're going to fail, and we need to understand what fail-safes we have in place or additional measures we're going to be putting in place when we inevitably screw this up.
Interest of time, we want to hold both Dr. Underwood and Dr. Smoller to short responses to this question.
Certainly. So from an industry standpoint, data regulations such as GDPR are very important to us, and certainly being compliant with regulations is extremely important to us. We have to think long and hard on how we draw the consents and how we use the data that we receive from patients, from people, understanding that for product approval, we do need patient-level data, particularly here in the United States. And so we want to keep data safe and only for the use for the benefit of people, for individuals, and capture it and not necessarily share it with all, but we do agree that data should be collected amongst all, and we should try to develop a culture of research so that everyone is very willingly participating in clinical trials that will make it a little bit easier for them to understand how they would want their data used in the future.
I'm sorry. I won't add much except to say, I assume that by the government protecting our privacy, you don't mean globally, you mean with respect to genetic information or research or something. So, I think I would underscore what others have said, which is that transparency, so that people understand where their data might go and who might have access and in what form, because there are ways to use the minimally, the most removed from identifiability you can, but sometimes you do need those kinds of things, and so there I think transparency and consent are very important. I also think we don't want to go too far in the other direction that we really cripple research because of the bad actors, and so having consequences in place, having the most, feasible but restrictive kind of use of data, and I think the All of Us program has done a good job with this, but these are going to be a moving target as technologies advance.
Yes.
So we already know that we don't implement what we know in medicine equitable. So we can talk about collecting data until we're blue in the face, but if we don't have a plan to use it to take care of our underserved communities, I'm not interested personally. Now, in terms of business, we know that underserved communities will make up more than 50% of the population, not too long a distant future. So it behooves the private sector to start thinking about this being a very important market, because as Dr. Anderson says, if you have a rare disease or if precision medicine means that there's a small number of people who would benefit, nobody's going to invest. But at some point, there are going to be a large number of these people. So I think that's really important. And I would like to also say that there has to be political activity in relation to this. To what extent people who work in this field are also working in Washington to help prepare the ground for being able to implement these advances among the people we want to serve.
I'll ask Dr. Gelbart and Mr. Bonham to respond to that.
Yeah, we started doing congressional briefings a few years ago because we heard from friends, I don't know if you'd agree, Vence, that genetics was almost a dirty word in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a word that lawmakers wanted to talk about. And so we go, I think it's always the challenge is getting people in the room to want to have information. D.C. is no exception. And what we did was we went not to advocate to lobby or to ask for money, but to share information about what technology was what technology was making possible, and then to provide more connections to researchers who had answers to their questions. And so, I mean, that was one that even in DC, the silos that exist between the researchers who are doing the analyses and the policymakers that are setting, and so decreasing those barriers, something that we're continuing to work on.
So with that, we will bring our panel
No.
You want to have a short?
Good.
Sorry, I'm getting flashed for time. So with that, we'll bring our panel discussion to a close. If we could have our panelists bring their chairs around, and we'll open it up for closing remarks by our next speaker. So thank you all for being here for this equity and social justice meeting on precision medicine. I think it's important to note that each of our panelists has sort of presented the idea that precision medicine is here. It started as a sort of goal of distant future medicine, but these issues are here, they're happening now in real time. So with that, I'll bring up our closing remarks speaker, Dr. Shauna Anderson. Dr. Anderson earned her MD PhD from Tufts University School of Medicine, where she graduated in 2013. She has devoted her career to biopharmaceutical research with a specialization in autoimmune and rare disease, having polished her skills at pharmaceutical companies, including Biogen, Agerion, and now Sanofi Genzyme. She is a complex problem solver who brings energy, integrity, and strong work ethic to translational medicine. Shauna is currently Director of Clinical Research in Rare Blood Disorders at Sanofi and has served as a student advisor at the 2016 and 2018 Boston Science Careers Student Conference. So she is a friend of the Office of Diversity and Community Partnership here at Harvard. Thank you, Shauna.
I wanted to thank you, Latrice, for inviting me. This has been incredibly interesting, and I've learned quite a bit, actually, by listening to the speakers that have come before, and by listening to the kinds of questions that people have and the conversations that it allows to happen. And I sincerely hope that these conversations do not end here, because that will basically reinforce the fact that we will bring it up. We think we've done our good job, pat ourselves on the back. We need to continue these conversations in every aspect of where we work. So we bring it back to our legislature, we bring it back to our divisions where we work, and we try to encourage and to expand these conversations, because that's the only way that we're actually going to get anything done. I don't know your name, sir, but to your point, we need a plan. And so I wanted to summarize by saying that that I've heard quite a bit, but one of the things that I really struck home was the fact that the significant lack of diversity that Dr. Bonham described would actually create harm for the populations for where data is lacking. And that is something that's really important to me. I am an MD PhD, obviously, so therefore data is very important to me. I also design clinical trials, and my entire job is designed around collecting enough data such that whatever drug it is that I am working on to try to promote and to get out into the community, which I hopefully believe will help and will actually improve the lives of others, that I need to have enough data to convince health authorities around the world and ethics committees around the world that one, this clinical trial is worth doing, and two, that the data that we're going to collect is actually going to be meaningful and is actually going to tell us whether or not the drug is going to help people. And so we have to have a plan of not only taking these information into play, but what are we going to do with it? And I think that there are many important questions that were brought up. How do we define race, ethnicity, places of origin? Because that makes a lot of difference. You don't think about it, but our statistical friends, they do. When it comes down to creating these algorithms for how we're going to
analyze our data. I mean, I actually just missed the statistical meeting today, but that was all about what kind of information do we put in our statistical analysis plan? How do we define populations? And then how do we summarize these data to mean something? If we don't know if we're using OMB, geographic, or ancestral origin, then who are we talking about? And what does that information mean? I think that, understanding, is there race? And if it does exist, then what role should it play in in our understanding of the data that we're bringing in? Our data means nothing if we can't integrate that and dispel it and understand what it means for all of us. I will also say that I also have somehow managed to hold two completely mutually exclusive understandings of whether or not race matters, and then what it means to our understanding of disease. I have also advocated that I need to look at race because I believe that there may be discrepancies in how my drug might work. But at the same time, I also don't believe that we are so very different genetically that there should really be a concept of race to begin with. I am incredibly encouraged by the fact that, the All of Us campaign is currently ongoing, and I really am looking forward to having 1 million people enrolled into a clinical study, completely diverse, a population where we can hopefully get a better understanding, because I think that the only way we can dispel or to, in fact, determine whether or not race truly exists is by collecting the data and doing the experiment. If we then compare all the data that we have and all the genetics, we may simply find out it doesn't mean very much at all. And that perhaps it's just polymorphisms that we see in various genes that may dictate whether or not you are a fast or slow metabolizer of a particular type of drug. And maybe that is where we need to focus the intent of our work. But we won't know until we can gather the trust and to educate the population so that they are willing to work with us. I have been scribbling away as I've been trying to gather all the thoughts and everything that has come up. I think that we are all horrified by the cases that we may not have known about that Dr. Jackson brought to light, especially the more recent one in 1997. One would have thought and hoped that IRBs and ethics committees would have put a stop to that. I know that it's quite challenging for myself to get through IRBs and to ethics committees on various studies that I want, and that they can be quite challenging, and they should be quite challenging. That is their job. It is to protect people. And so we need to do a better job. We need to ensure that those who sit on IRBs understand what it is that they're looking at and understand the impact and the downstream effects of the studies that they are allowing to go on. And from a perspective of a sponsor and somebody who's bringing those studies there, we need to have very significant introspection as well. What are we asking of these communities? We're asking them to give us our data. What are we going to do with that data? And if we hope to do any sort of exploratory research, which many of us want to do once we have these information, once we have these samples, because it's a treasure trove, right? It's going to be a way for us to figure things out. But we really need to have a very, very, and I think a across-the-board conversation, industry in terms of in academia, as well as in politics, for what are we allowing to happen? And how frequently do we have to go back to patients and say, you know what? Thank you so much for giving us your data. This is the result of that experiment that you actually allowed us to do. We have your sample, and this is the next experiment, if you so wish, that we would like to do. Many times we do have to go back and reconsent because the intent that they gave us the sample is no longer the intent in which we have to use it. But we need to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to get fooled into thinking that just because we have the sample, it means that we have the permission to do whatever we wish to it. And I think that that needs to be something that's very carefully looked at, because otherwise we will never gain the trust. And therefore we will never be able to enroll communities where we actually really need to study, to make sure that we are incorporating into our programs, because otherwise we risk the potential of significant harm because we simply don't have the data And we might be giving drugs to people for whom, or treatments to people for whom they will not benefit, and in fact will actually hurt them in the long run. We need to understand what it is that we're doing. And I think that it's very important from a diversity conversation that it is not only those for whom we are interested in studying, but those who are doing the studying itself, those who are creating the trials, those who are analyzing the data, the statisticians that are putting together the statistical analysis plan, and those to whom we will give the task of actually explaining what it is that we found. Because in many cases, and I know many of you will feel the same, the language that we speak to one another, this doctorese, is not something that's easily consumable to the general public at large. And so there are many people in pharma and many perhaps in academia who are tasked with the job of explaining what it is that we found, and something outside of just like a peer review article that we publish in JAMA or in the New England Journal of Medicine, which for most people have absolutely no access, nor will they be willing to find or to read or even understand. Because I think that's where we build trust too. We need to understand what it is that we're saying, what we're finding, and how can we convey that information to the communities who actually need it. Because that's where they're going to be making, the decisions that they're making to take a drug or to take a treatment or to whether or not to get into the trial is going to depend on that level of trust. So I think it's a very interesting conversation that you brought up, and the idea of ownership. I think that's something that we need to talk about. Who owns it? I know that the IP lawyers, if they were to hear this particular conversation, would not agree at all. But we need to have that conversation, because perhaps that's one way to lay a brick to build trust. I don't know whether it's going to go anywhere, but it's worth having a conversation to ask. And I think that, as I said before, for me, working in rare disease, the concept of cost. The clinical trials that I run, because I work in rare disease, there are only a few thousand people around the world oftentimes that actually have the disease that I'm interested in or that I'm working towards. So my clinical trials generally cost a whole lot less than his clinical trials on cardiovascular disease, because we're talking thousands, 9,000, 10,000 patients when it comes to some of the phase 3 clinical trials to really get the data. My trials, I'm lucky if we get up into the hundreds. So cost often is quite low. But I still have the same, and I should have the same process. I have to do, research. I have to do toxicology. I have to do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, in order to really understand what's happening. And that's the route that all these research have to take. Perhaps we can use some of the emerging technologies to try to minimize some of these stages, but in the end, we cannot necessarily understand what's going to happen in a person by what happens in an animal, or by what happens in a computer model. We have to do the study. We have to do the experiments, and we have to analyze that data. But I think cost is quite important. I don't want that the drugs that I work on is only going to be used for those who can afford it. Ultimately, I want the drugs that I work on to be used for those who need it. But how can we make sure that those people actually have access to it? I think we need to consider Medicare, Medicaid. I think that those are conversations that are currently happening around the world. Many other countries, they negotiate quite hard on a country basis for price points for the drugs that we bring in. They decide based on the benefit and the risk for their entire population which drugs might actually get in. And sometimes that may seem unfair, but they have limited resources, and so they have to decide what kinds of drugs can we bring in. So they may not take the newest, flashiest, drug that comes out there with the higher price tag. They may go with the tried and true options, which may not necessarily be the best for their patients, or may not necessarily be, the most efficacious. But they know in many cases it works, and that has to be the best thing for them. So how do we sort of balance these absolutes? The U.S. is definitely much more on the freer side. It's really dependent a lot on the insurance companies, whereas in many other countries it's really dependent on a government basis. And I don't know that either is right. I think we need to figure out where that balance lies so that the most people who need the drug have access to it. But at the same time, as I say, the investment in making sure that these drugs are safe, that they are efficacious, that is quite high. And so unless we find a way to minimize that cost, companies simply aren't going to put the investment out there if they don't seek any sort of return on that investment. So we need to figure out a way to balance these aspects of things. And I think ultimately one of the major questions that we need to ask is it fairness or is it equity? Now, fairness is a very interesting concept. What's fair to one person may not at all be fair to another. It's really quite subjective. Equity, on the other hand, equity can be quantified to a certain extent. You get a pair, so do you. Everyone gets a pair. That may be, in many ways, something that we want to go forward with. We want to make sure that each person has what they need. So maybe you don't need a pair. Maybe you're allergic to that pair. So we have to figure out what are we going to do and how are we going to get the medicines, the treatments, the information to the communities who need it, those who deserve it, and for those for whom it's actually going to make the most impact. I'm going to end here, but I really am so grateful to have had all of you in one room to hear what you had to say. And I really hope that each of us take these information, take these discussions, and I know I definitely will, back to where we are and incorporate these discussions into what we do, because that's the only way we're going to make a change. And I would ask that when it comes to policy, that we pull something together. We try to make a way for all of us who are sitting at the table and those who are much higher than us can sit down and actually have these important conversations. Because I think that policy, technology is always outstripping the policy. And we need to find some way to make that comparable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for your wonderful remarks and trying to summarize such a varied topic. I want to say a couple rounds of thank yous. Thank you to Jackie Wright, Teresa Ying, and the rest of the DICP staff for helping to pull this together. Thank you to Dr. Landry for all of your hard work pulling this together. And thank you to our keynote, Mr. Bonham, our panelists, and again to you, Dr. Anderson, for closing our remarks. I just want to draw everybody's attention to the back of the brochure. On there are a list of other equity and social justice activities that we have going on, including next Wednesday. We're doing a conversation on Asian American health and the intersectionalities that go along with those communities. There's some other events that will be discussed, including we have a discussion around maternal fetal health as well as the digital divide, both of those happening in May. So look forward to those email announcements. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for participating. And again, another round of applause for our keynote and our panelists. And enjoy your morning. Thank you.